What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today we are doing a full price breakdown on how much it costs to K-swap a Subaru BRZ. So I've got all of the prices of every single item that I've bought over the last 2.5 years, going through the process of building this thing. So I'm gonna list out the price of the item, and I'm also gonna have a counter somewhere down here for the total as we sort of run through the list. At the end, I will have sort of some alternate options because this is one of the more expensive routes you can go by swapping the transmission, going with a turbo, a bunch of custom fabrication and all that kind of stuff. So if you want more of a simple builds or an NA K24 swap, those sort of alternate options will be at the end. I just kind of want to dive into all of the numbers that we have here. So first, starting off, we're going to go through the main drivetrain components that I purchased. So starting with the Honda K24A, which is actually the JDM version of the K24A2, I got that from an importer for $1,060 shipped. Next, we've got two different items from K-Power there. The first swap kit I have is for their oil pan and their engine mounts. And those two in total came out to $1,624. Now, the rest of the K-Power swap kit was $5,482. Now, this included the fully built wiring harness, the Haltech standalone ECU, the fuel rail, let's see what else. Next up, we have the transmission, which is a CD009 out of a 2008 G35, I believe, if I remember correctly, from when I ordered it, 2.5 years ago. And used and shipped, that was $1,450. Now, in order to pair the K24 with the CD009, we needed a different adapter than the one that K-Power provides, because that is intended to be used for the stock BRZ FRS transmission. And so I got mine from Collins, and their full adapter kit with the adapter plate, the flywheel adapter, the clutch, and the pressure plate all came out to $1,735. Because of the fact that I'm using the K-Power engine mounts, but I'm using a different transmission, I needed a different trans mount. So I got the Toge Factory or the TF Works transmission mount. That was $280. And to pair up with the CD009, I needed a shifter relocator kit because the CD is not exactly perfect length to match up with the shifter hole in the car. So I went with a Serial 9 shifter relocation kit, and that was a flat $500. To refresh the CD009, because it was used, I wanted a new throwout bearing, I wanted a new pivot ball and pivot fork. Those internals in total cost me $271. I got that from Z1 Motorsports. The clutch line from the master cylinder to the slave cylinder I got from Chase Bays, because that's just about the only version of a clutch line that I could find that would match the OEM Subaru BRZ clutch master cylinder and would actually reach the slave cylinder on the external slave for the CD009. That was $64.99. And now we kind of get into the turbo stuff. So I got a Pulsar GTX 3076. It's essentially a Garrett 3076 replica. That was $950. The Toge Factory turbo manifold was $1,295. So that more or less covers the turbo manifold and the turbo itself. I did start with a Pulsar wastegate, but once we got on the dyno, we did inevitably switch over to a Turbo Smart because we were having some boost issues and we weren't sure if it was the wastegate was the problem or what was going on. So I eventually switched over to a Turbo Smart Hypergate 45, and that run me right around $450. Next up, we have the Mishimoto intercooler, which is $287. The accessories for the K24 engine, which included AC compressor, alternator, not the water pump because I got a different water pump, I'll talk about that one, AC alternator, and I believe the idler pulley. All of those from Rock Auto cost me $465. A new K24 starter motor was $129, and then the custom aluminum drive shaft to mate the CD009 to the stock BRZ diff was $881. I had that made by Driveline Services of North Atlanta, I believe, is the company that fabbed that for me. They did a great job. The single piece aluminum drive shaft is perfect. And so if we take all of those items and look at the subtotal that we have right now, we should be sitting somewhere around $16,475. Now that's just the engine, transmission, turbo, and drive shaft, and all of that stuff in order to sort of get it running. That's like the basics that you need, right? But we still don't have intercooler pipe. We still don't have exhaust, turbo downpipe to match up with, if you're gonna run the sort of stock catback, kind of like how I did mine, or if you're gonna run a full custom set. We haven't gotten to any of that yet. That mostly just covers the main drivetrain components. So now we get into engine accessories, which is all of the stuff on the outside and really a lot of small little bits and pieces, but I want to include them because all of those small bits really total up to quite a large amount. So starting off, we had the Skunk 2 timing cover, the billet aluminum 2-piece timing cover. That was $339. The K-tuned valve cover, the vented valve cover right here up top, this nice pretty unit right here, that was $419. The Skunk 2 valve cover hardware, so I basically was trying to sort of combine Skunk 2, K-tuned, hybrid racing, all of like the sort of quintessential Honda brands. I wanted to get as much of that in there as I could. So we had Skunk 2 timing cover, K-tuned valve cover, and then the Skunk 2 hardware for the valve cover. That came in at $86. For the fuel system, we did Graham's 1000cc injectors. Those were $465. The timing cover oil return for the turbo drain, I have the oil return coming off of the turbo going back to the front of that Skunk 2 timing cover, and that unit, which was a billet aluminum piece, cost me $159. Kind of a lot for just one little piece with a -10 AN fitting on it. Turbo oil drain kit from Pulsar, which is just the extra fittings to make sure that everything bolts up to the bottom of the turbo properly, was $45. And then we kind of went with some extra goodies, things that were really not necessary, but things that I wanted to spend money on because I'm a shill. The K-tuned dipstick and oil cap. The dipstick was $103, and the K24 oil cap from K-tuned I have as $419, which doesn't seem right. That seems way too expensive, so I must have messed up my spreadsheet somewhere. I'll put the right number in here and we'll tally it up appropriately. I have the timing chain set was $155 in order to get a new timing chain. I wanted to replace the flywheel bolts and get new flywheel bolts so that whenever I put that really, really big aluminum flywheel adapter on there, I wanted to make sure that we had a good seal, so I got some new flywheel bolts. Those were $55. Thermostat housing plug from Hybrid Racing, as well as a Hybrid Racing shift knob. Those two in total cost me $113. The lower radiator hose was $14.83. The upper radiator hose was $28.28. And I needed to get some reducer fittings to make the new hose that I had to adapt fit onto the piece of the, it's all the explanation of the details is in the entire series. But I needed some adapters for my coolant hoses, and that cost me $32.51. Buying a new thermostat and a new thermostat housing in total was $120. the water pump adapters that I bought from Track Tough to essentially supply and return the coolant to the turbo in total cost me 81 bucks from Track Tough. All of the AN lines, fittings, adapters, all of those little pieces, I've got them, you know, I probably have 25 different orders between Amazon and all of the other different brands that make the AN adapters. So all of the AN lines, -4, -6, and -10 AN lines, fittings, adapters, all of that together cost $613. The Greddy oil sandwich plate, which is what I'm using to feed my oil to the turbo as well as run my oil cooler, cost me $131. And then we've got a bunch of sensors and just making sure that all my sort of electrical bits and pieces and components are, you know, new and in order and aren't going to break on me as soon as I started the engine up. We had oil pressure sensor adapter was 42. We had a new VTEC solenoid was 65. Crankshaft position sensor and camshaft position sensor were 45 apiece. Manifold absolute pressure sensor from Skunk 2, it's a 4-bar, was 109. I got a new cabin air filter for 21 bucks. I needed an intake manifold gasket as well as an air pressure sensor for $77.36. I had to get a new throttle body because the old one that I had was having a bunch of issues and wasn't calibrating right, so I had to get a new throttle body. So that cost me $152. If you recall, on the transmission, I ended up having 2 broken bolts in the mounting holes that go all the way in the back of the trans where they bolt into the tunnel. There was like a 2-month process of me trying to get those things drilled out and all of that. So I needed to fix those threads once all of that work was done. So I used some Easy Lock threaded inserts. Those were 78 bucks. Various O-rings and hardware was $26, and the exhaust gasket and the silicone hose for the wastegate and the blow-off valve, those 2 items in total cost $31. So that should bring the total up to about close to 21,000 already, and we've got 2 more sections of stuff to talk about. Now we're going to get into the piping and fabrication. So all the intercooler, all of the exhaust, all the clamps, all the everything, right? So in order to fabricate the mount for the intercooler, I needed some aluminum flat bar. So I just bought stock 1-inch thick, 1/8 inch wide flat aluminum stock. That in total cost me 43 bucks, rather cheap actually. The intercooler tubes and all of the couplers and the clamps that I bought as a kit, sort of a universal set online, I bought 2 1/4 as well as 2.5 inch tubing, and that kit, those 2 kits together cost me $345. Next, I had the 3-inch stainless for the turbo downpipe and the rest of the exhaust, as well as a 3-inch by 4-inch flex hose, or like flex pipe really. So basically it helps to sort of alleviate some of the vibrations and keep the turbo and the mid-turbo manifold from cracking as the engine vibrates and it's not connecting to the rest of the engine. Those 2 cost me $183. And then flange bolts and hose clamps, 13, stainless steel hardware, another 25. Now, if you recall, I almost chopped my thumb off in this entire process. While I was cutting all of this stuff, I got my thumb too close to a bandsaw. I'll spare you the nitty-gritty details, but once that happened, I wasn't really able to do much more of the welding after that point because my thumb was wrapped up in a big bandage and I couldn't bend it at all, so I couldn't really feed filler rod. I wasn't going to be super efficient with my left hand. I wasn't going to be able to weld all that well. So a lot of the fabrication I kind of had to resort to cutting the tubes myself, getting it all sort of mocked up and taped together, and then taking those over to a welding shop to actually have them welded together, fabricated. So shout out to Heat Lightning Speed Shop in Gainesville, Georgia. They did a phenomenal job on all of the welds that I gave them, even if my fit up was not so great. So they really helped me out and worked with me a lot. So for our aluminum intercooler pipe welding, we're looking at 176 just for welding the aluminum stuff. And then for the stainless, we're looking at about 525 for the welding. Now, why is the stainless so much more expensive than the aluminum? One of the reasons is because of the fact that I wanted them to back purge the stainless, which is something that I would have done if I was welding it, but couldn't. And so that required a lot more time to set up, so the labor hours were higher. The material cost was higher because they're having to pump argon through the inside of the tubes as they're welding them. So the stainless fabrication cost a good bit more than the aluminum did in terms of just the labor and the fabrication for that. Then for the intercooler piping, once it was welded together, I needed to bead roll the edges so that the silicone couplers that go on to the end of the tubes actually have something to hold on to as we're building boost. You don't want your silicone couplers popping off and then you have a big boost leak and your engine's running lean and whatever. So a tube bead roller cost me 64 bucks on Amazon. It's a pretty good deal. And then I had some O2 sensor bungs, the cost of those, and some various things that went along with that was $39. Additional 3-inch stainless V-band clamps was another $44, and more clamps again was $12. So all of that sort of fabrication and the tubes required to do all of that came out to $14.93, which when you think about it, like you could buy a new exhaust, like just a kit, like a catback. Some catbacks would cost you $1,500 bucks. So to do all of the intercooler and basically half of the exhaust, really not too bad in terms of fabrication on that side of things. All right, and so now we are on to the final assembly. Basically, what do we, now that everything's more or less put together, what do we need to finish this thing up and get this thing to the dyno, essentially? Motor oil, coolant, and an Optima red top battery in total came out to 408 bucks. Valvoline 5W30 was $33. Some funnels and brake fluids was $21. Flange bolts and hose clamps, so a lot of those different, various clamping of hoses that you find. It's like, oh, I didn't realize I didn't put a clamp on that hose. I need to make sure, 1/4-inch clamps, 5/16, 3/8 clamps, just back and forth to the hardware store, to the O'Reilly's or something, just to grab various clamps. Was, we said 21. I bought a vacuum brake bleeder kit, not for my brakes, but for the clutch line from the master cylinder to the slave cylinder. I needed to bleed the clutch, right? And so because I'm doing this whole thing by myself, I can't really sit there and hold the clutch and crack the bleeder at the same time, right? So that from Amazon was $56. A 10mm banjo hose barb fitting, $9. The Vibrant stainless J-bend tubing, this really should have gone in the fabrication section. This is what I used to make the wastegate dump. Vibrant J-bend was 73 bucks, so that really should have gone on the fabrication section. So fuel line fitting, $6, vinyl tubing, and stainless steel clamps for, I guess, wastegate. And everything's getting a little jumbled together here, guys, so I'm either over accounting by a few hundred or under accounting by a few hundred. It's 2.5 years of trying to track expenses is a little bit tough. I bought some exhaust wrap from DEI. You can get that on Amazon or you can buy it from them directly. That was $61.50. Had the K&N air intake filter. This guy right here was 53 bucks. A vacuum tee, which I used for the blow-off valve pressure reference to the intake manifold, the vacuum reference. A new brake booster vacuum hose was $70.60. Actually quite a rare item. I had to go to the dealership the Subaru dealership to get one, and they said there were only 3 in the country at the time, so weird. Stainless steel clamps for 18, some Permatex gasket maker for 35, 1.5-inch heat shroud for my coolant hose because it runs right next to the turbo manifold, trying to keep some of the heat out of the coolant system. That heat shroud cost 53 bucks. Engine grounding straps for $10.59, high temp thread sealer for 10 bucks. Some sea foam and Permatex orange thread lock was 28. And that was just about everything that got me more or less to the finish line, all the way up until I went to the tuning. And then if you guys have watched the entire series, you will know that we tried tuning, we had some problems, the engine got pulled out, engine got put back in, and then we finished the tuning. So I'm not going to include the cost of all of that extra work that I had to pay the shop to do all of that stuff. I'm just gonna give if we had gone to the dyno and tuned it and it had worked the first time, their flat rate for an entire day of tuning was $850. So with all of that said and done, the engine prep final assembly section comes out to $2548-ish. And then if we take all of those numbers and throw them together, our grand total comes out to $24,920. So technically, we just barely beat the $25,000 mark for an engine swap. Now, did it cost me $24,920? No, it cost me a good bit more than that. Like I was just saying, there was a lot of extra work that needed to happen at the end of last year with the shop where the car was getting tuned. So that was obviously more expensive. And then all of the fabrication stuff that I did, between buying bandsaws, buying a miter saw, buying a belt sander, welding supplies, a lot of that stuff that I needed to, all those little bits and pieces, like there's some bigger tools, and then there's every trip to get a couple of M8 bolts, every trip to get a couple extra clamps, every trip to the hardware store, to the O'Reilly's, the Advanced, to get this and that. Oh, I need some more Permatex Ultra Black. I need a brake cleaner. All of these different things. When I took my raw numbers before I excluded anything, we were a lot closer to that $30,000 mark. So yeah, it's kind of crazy to think about how much money car enthusiasts are willing to dump into their stupid projects. That is more or less the full build list, the full build cost. Now, $25,000 I would say is an average estimate. There were a lot of things that I could have gone without, especially the kind of the pretty stuff, the fancy timing cover, the fancy valve cover, the, all of the different things that I didn't need to get. There's a lot of spots where you can save money, and you probably could do this for a lot closer to $20,000 if you really can pinch pennies, and if you already have a bunch of tools. Like if you already have a method for cutting and welding tubing, and you have the skill, or you have a buddy who can do that for you for free, or you know somebody who will do that for very cheap, you could realistically get this done for, I would say, 22 on a very conservative end. I mean, there's still a lot of things that are going to be expensive, but at the end of the day, if you have the disposable income and you're not avoiding eating or going into severe debt to be able to do this, and you have the passion and it's something that you really, really want to do, and you know that this will make you happier at the end of the day, money is just numbers on a screen at this point. So my vote is always, try and be conservative and save a little bit for your future retirement, all that kind of stuff. But if you have some extra money on the side to do what makes you happy, then do what makes you happy. Build your dreams. That's my whole motto for the channel. So anyway, I'll get off the high horse. Let's talk about some alternate options. So starting on the high end, I would say my build is definitely up there in terms of how much money you can spend. Now, if you want to redo your whole suspension, if you want to get a different rear diff, if you want to get stronger axles, which I probably will end up upgrading to eventually, this build list and the expense list can get as big as you want it to be. But if you want to do it similar to how I've done it, you're gonna be looking in that 25 to 30 range, maybe 22 on the cheap end to 30 kind of on the higher end. Now, if you wanted to stay on the stock transmission, if you weren't planning on making 400 horsepower to the wheels or higher, if you're kind of wanting 350 horsepower and say 300-ish foot-pounds of torque, you could stay on the stock transmission as opposed to going with the CD009. In that case, when you're ordering your initial swap kit, whether you're getting it from K-Power or from Toge Factory, the adapter with K-Power, it's a little bit easier because it's all from one company. But if you buy the engine and transmission mounts as a part of their kit, and you would buy their adapter and flywheel, would be cheaper than the Collins adapter that I ended up having to go with in order to make the CD transmission work. So on that end, you're probably looking a little bit closer to the 20,000 mark. At least that's what I would expect, because you're saving on buying an extra transmission, you're saving a good amount of money on the adapter to make it work. K-Power, as a part of their swap kit, they will send you a new drive shaft, fully balanced and all that kind of stuff. And so you don't have to hammer out your transmission tunnel a lot like I did. So it'll save you a lot of time and frustration at the very least. But I would say if you're gonna stay with the stock transmission and you're going with, say, like a Pulsar turbo like I did, which is more of a budget turbo as opposed to a Precision or a Garrett where you're gonna be spending over $2,000 just on your turbo, I would say you're gonna be closer to that maybe $18,000 to $20,000 range. That's what I would typically expect that type of a build to cost. And that's no additional, no bigger cams, no additional engine work. Obviously, if you're not building the transmission with forged internals or anything, but that's definitely on the higher end, not the cheaper end, obviously. And then really your cheapest option, if you want to get into it and you want to do a K-swap, you want to stay naturally aspirated, non-turbo, you'll be staying with the stock transmission. I would say the number you're trying to shoot for or kind of come in below would be 15,000. Now, depending on which engine you buy, you can get a K24A2 for a lot cheaper, say $600 or $700 used. The reason I went with the JDM engine is because of the fact that it was lower miles. It only had 50,000 miles, or at least that's what the importer told me, right? I can only go off of the information I'm given, right? But if you get maybe a slightly more used engine for say $600, $700, $800, and you can essentially go to K-Power's website and just buy their full kit. That is about as easy as it's going to get. Realistically, I think you can expect to get 230-ish horsepower, depending on if you're running 93 octane, your pump injectors. If you decide to go bigger cams, you can do that. But if you're going with the full K-Power kit, right now, I think runs about 10,500 the last time I checked. I'll put it up here somewhere. And then you're gonna have all of the miscellaneous stuff. You're gonna end up needing extra hose clamps. You're gonna have to buy the coolant lines, which is in total probably under $100 for that. But you're gonna have miscellaneous costs that end up adding, an extra $2,000 or so. So I would say like a hyper conservative estimate to do the swap, if you're buying the full K-Power kit, would be under 13,000, but I think more realistically, you're probably coming in a little bit closer to 15,000. So that's gonna wrap it up. Leave me your comments down below if you think that I spent too much money on this, or if you're surprised that I didn't spend any more money on this than I actually did. When I've told people like how much I've spent on this, the question is, well, was it worth it? Was it worth all the time, the effort, and all of that money to get this end result? And for me, the answer is absolutely yes. The result for me has been, over the last month that the car has been finished, has been fantastic. And obviously we're gonna get a lot more driving videos out there eventually once I can get the car registered and legally on the street. I have learned more in these last 2.5 years doing this whole thing 100% on my own, apart from some of the welding, I have learned so much more than I ever could have imagined that I would learn. My mechanical aptitude, my welding skill, my fabrication, like creativity, because I had to build this intercooler mount from scratch. There was no design. I had to just come up with it because no one makes an intercooler mount for the turbo for the K-swap yet. That's, I'm sure, either K-Power's working on it or maybe Toge Factory's got something in the works. But for right now, there aren't a whole lot of options for intercooler and turbo downpipe stuff. It's all kind of has to be custom unless something's come up in the last couple of months that I haven't seen. Yeah, there's obviously going to be a lot more content to come. This is not even close to being done. We've got big brake kit, we've got half cage, seats, harnesses, steering wheel, interior upgrades, probably suspension upgrades, probably have to do axles in the future. Probably get a new set of wheels at some point, so that'll be exciting to see that whole thing. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure to give it a thumbs up down below. If you did enjoy it, subscribe to the channel so you can see everything else that I just listed off that we're gonna be doing with this thing in the future. And until next time, build your dreams.